So I will not talk about the indications of fixation. I'll just go straight to fixing the distal radius fracture once the decision has been made. There are various surgical options. Personally, the vast majority of my fractures are fixed with the ORIF. I'm sure many of you use ORIF as the mainstay of surgical treatment as well. So when we talk about ORIF, there are locking implants, non-locking implants, there's volar plating, dorsal plating. Less commonly, I also use headless compression screws to fix a very, very specific subset of distal radius fractures. And along the way, when we fix distal radius fractures, we need certain adjuncts such as circlage wires and bone grafts, which I'll cover later. Much less commonly, I'll use percutaneous pinning as well, and very, very uncommonly, external fixation as a surgical treatment. So these are just some of my surgical considerations when I'm doing open reduction and inclined fixation, the approach, how I reduce fragments, handling depressed articular fragments, and like Dr. Sunil mentioned earlier, the screws, place them as distal as possible using the raft concept. Bone grafting, I do bone graft my distal radius fractures occasionally, with the aim of restoring all the extra-articular parameters as well as intra-articular parameters. So we all are well versed with advantages of the locking system, so I will not dwell on it, but I use the distal radius plate as an indirect reduction technique as well as to recreate the volar tilt. I'm sure many of you do too. This is just one example of a locking plate. So what I mean by indirect reduction technique is what has been described as a condylar stabilizing technique. Back in my institution, I just call it the lift technique, where we put in the distal screws first, and then we put in the proximal cortical screw in order to correct the volar tilt, as well as I use it to correct the radial inclination as well. In fact, some time ago, we used some trigonometric principles to make the whole lift technique a little bit more accurate, which I use on a regular basis. As for the approach with locking implants, I think most of us use volar approach primarily, but I still do use a dorsal approach, approximately 5% of my cases. And when do I use dorsal approach? When there's a dorsal partial articular fracture, like a dorsal Barton's, I use a dorsal approach. Or when the fracture line is very, very distal on the volar cortex, I use a dorsal approach as well. Or if there's a large dorsal articular fragment that I cannot reduce from a volar approach, particularly when you fix the fractures late rather than early, then I do use a dorsal approach as well. So as an example, you can see in this particular case, from volar approach, the fracture is so distal that you cannot reliably put a plate in there and start early mobilization. So the fracture was fixed purely using a dorsal approach, using locking plates. It may look like the plate is too distal, but actually if you look at the joint view, it is right subchondral. And another case, this is an inferior arc type of injury. Again, from a volar approach, you will not see the fracture at all. The fracture is mainly over the dorsal and the radial surfaces. And so using a dorsal approach, just putting in a radial plate as well as a dorsal plate, managed to fix the fracture. Over here, you really can't see what's happening because there's just heavy metal in there. But once you remove the implants, it's a fairly decent fixation. So very, very occasionally, I do use sandwich plating, combined volar and dorsal approach for certain AOC3 fractures. So this is just one example of a case which was fixed, I think about 2-3 weeks after the fracture, and I had some difficulty reducing the dorsal-ulnar fragment. So I had to go volar and dorsal in order to fix the fracture. And this was just a paper that we wrote back some time ago, and to show that the outcome following a combined volar dorsal plating, the complication rate is actually fairly low. But I must say that ever since I started using variable angle locking plates, the need for me to do a combined volar and dorsal approach is actually much less. So I think we've been using variable angle locking plates for about 15 years now back home. So much less cases of sandwich plating. So I do use bone graft, although I must say I use synthetic bone graft substitutes rather than bone graft. And the reason why I put bone graft in the acute setting is mainly to correct articular steps. When there are depressed articular fragments, I use bone grafts to just elevate the fragment before I put in the plate. This is just a slide on, when you have severe diaphyseal comminution, like in this case, how do I manage such fractures? So when you surgically manage such a fracture, I use a concept of either a neutralization plating or a bridge plating. So neutralization plating, where the intervening diaphyseal fragments, you stabilize them before you put a plate across. So in this particular case, where possible, I use leg screws to fix the diaphyseal fragment, and then you neutralize it with a plating. I put the neutralization in open inverted commas because purists, AO purists, will say that this is not really neutralization, which is why neutralization is in open inverted commas. But when the fragments are too small or very comminuted, I use circlarch wires in order to stabilize the intervening fragment before neutralization plating across. Occasionally, I do use bridge plating concept where I completely ignore the intervening diaphyseal fragments and I just distract the fracture, usually putting in the distal screws first and then putting in the proximal screws. How do I distract the fracture? So this is just one example. And usually the fractures heal. Distal radius fractures are very forgiving. They heal. If they don't heal, there's a problem with you. It's usually the surgeon's fault if the fracture doesn't heal. So how do I distract? Either by using an external fixator, or I like to use this device, the AO distraction device. Back home, it comes in the 4.5 set. So I use this distraction device, and you can use it for the distal radius plate. Or sometimes all you need is a very strong assistant to hold the arm while the primary surgeon puts in the screw. Percutaneous pinning of distal radius fractures, like the earlier speakers mentioned, very, very uncommonly do I use percutaneous pinning. With increased use of internal fixation devices, better implants, I think utilization of percutaneous pinning is decreasing because it is less rigid and you also need to delay the mobilization. Strong indications, pediatric patients where the growth plate hasn't fused yet and where cost is an issue, there is an option as well. So one of the questions asked by members of the audience, when prerequisites for percutaneous pinning, I think there must be no metaphyseal comminution, no significant shortening, particularly no volar cortex comminution, no articular comminution, and there must be good bone quality. And you must fix it early. If you fix it late, it's a little bit difficult to use a percutaneous fixation. So you can either do it interfocal or you can do it intrafocal, the Kapanji technique. So one example of a pediatric patient where the fracture kept collapsing with manual reduction, where Kapanji pinning was done using the classic 3-4-4-5 as well as a radial pin and with good outcome. Very, very rarely when I have radial styloid fractures, AOB1 fractures, minimal comminution, I use headless compression screw. The advantage is there's minimal dissection. As you can see over here, this is obviously a case of an axial dislocation with a radial styloid fracture where the radial styloid was just fixed with a screw fixation. External fixation, I very rarely use it, but these are the indications for external fixation in distal radius fractures. And often when I do use external fixation, it's always supplemented by K wires. I must say I haven't done an external fixation of a distal radius fracture in more than 10 years. It's over.